Leucippus begins his philosophy with a problem that had troubled Greek thinkers for generations. How can change be real? We look around and see everything changing. A plant grows from a seed. A person grows from childhood into old age. Water becomes vapor and later returns as rain. A building is constructed and eventually falls apart. Something that was not there yesterday appears today, while something that existed for years can disappear. Yet if we think carefully, change seems to create a difficult problem. If something comes into existence from absolute nothing, how could that happen? How can nothing produce something? And if something completely disappears into nothing, what exactly has happened to what existed before? Leucippus refuses to accept that nature is built on such a mystery. He searches for a deeper explanation. His answer becomes one of the earliest forms of atomism. The idea that reality is composed of tiny bodies moving through empty space. The visible world is constantly changing, but beneath those changes there are things that do not themselves come into existence or vanish. The larger objects around us are formed when these smaller bodies come together, and they disappear when those arrangements break apart. What looks like creation and destruction may therefore be nothing more than combination and separation. A house is built from materials that already existed. When the house is destroyed, those materials remain in different forms. A living body develops from matter that was already present in nature. When the body dies, its components do not simply become nothing. The form disappears. The underlying matter remains. This is the basic intuition behind Leucippus' philosophy. But for this explanation to work, he needs two things: atoms and void. The atoms are the solid bodies that exist. The void is empty space. Without the void, there would be no room for atoms to move. Without movement, there would be no way to explain the changing world we experience. So reality cannot consist only of matter filling every possible space. There must also be emptiness. This was a profound philosophical claim. The void is not a visible object. We do not normally notice empty space as something that exists. Yet Leucippus argues that it must exist if movement is real. Look at an ordinary room. There are walls, furniture, people, objects, and countless other physical things. But there are also spaces between them. Those spaces allow bodies to move from one location to another. On a larger scale, the same principle applies throughout nature. Atoms move through the void. They collide. They separate. They combine. They form temporary structures. Those structures become the things we recognize as the world. This gives Leucippus a completely different way of thinking about change. Change does not require reality itself to appear from nowhere. It can happen through rearrangement. The same basic elements can produce different forms depending upon how they are positioned and connected. Consider letters arranged into words. The letters themselves remain the same, but changing their arrangement changes the meaning. In a similar way, different arrangements of matter can produce completely different objects. The important point is that the difference between things does not necessarily require different kinds of basic substance. Different structures can emerge from the same fundamental ingredients. This allows Leucippus to explain the extraordinary variety of nature without requiring an equally enormous number of fundamental substances. There may be countless visible things, but underneath that variety, there can be a much simpler reality. Atoms differ in their shapes, sizes, positions, and arrangements. Their movements create different combinations. Those combinations produce the forms we encounter. The world therefore becomes understandable through structure and movement. This is one of the most important features of Leucippus' thought. He is not satisfied with saying that things change. He wants to know how change is possible. That question pushes philosophy toward a more mechanical understanding of nature. Instead of asking what purpose every event serves, he asks what conditions make the event happen. Instead of treating change as something mysterious, he looks for a physical explanation. Instead of beginning with human experience and making the universe revolve around it, he begins with nature itself. This approach has consequences for the way we understand the world. A tree does not need to exist because nature has given it a special purpose intended for human beings. Rain does not have to fall because the universe has decided that a particular community deserves it. An earthquake does not need to be a message. A disease does not automatically have to be a punishment. Events can have causes within nature. This does not mean that Leucippus possessed anything close to modern science. His theory was philosophical, and many details of ancient atomism were later developed or changed. But the direction of the question was remarkably important. Look for causes within the natural world. Do not stop at appearances. Do not assume that everything requires a human-like intention behind it. Nature can be investigated as a system. This also changes how we think about necessity. Leucippus is associated with a famous statement often translated roughly as, "Nothing happens by chance, but everything happens for a reason and by necessity." The exact wording and interpretation are debated because so little of his original work survives. But the idea captures something central to the Atomism picture. Events arise from physical conditions. One movement leads to another. One collision creates another result. The arrangement of matter at one moment affects what becomes possible at the next. The world is not simply a sequence of disconnected surprises. It has order. This does not mean that every event has a purpose in the human sense. A stone falling does not need to be trying to reach the ground. A storm does not need to want anything. Atoms do not have intentions. The order comes from the way physical things interact. This distinction is important. Purpose and cause are not the same thing. We often explain human actions by asking what someone intended, but nature can operate without intention. A river does not need a plan in order to carve a valley. Wind does not need a desire in order to move through a landscape. Leucippus pushes philosophy toward this kind of explanation. Nature does not have to think in order to produce order. This idea becomes even more powerful when applied to living things. Life does not necessarily require a completely separate substance that stands outside physical nature. Living beings can be understood as particular arrangements of matter. Their bodies have structures. Their parts interact. Their functions depend upon physical organization. This approach eventually becomes central to later materialist philosophies. But Leucippus is careful, in the surviving fragments and reports about his thought, to focus primarily on the physical structure of reality. The ethical system developed more fully by later thinkers should not simply be placed into his mouth. What we can say with greater confidence is that his atomism creates a foundation for thinking about human beings as part of nature. We are not made from materials fundamentally disconnected from the rest of the universe. The same natural reality that forms stones, plants, animals, and stars also forms us. That can feel humbling. Human beings often imagine themselves as separate from the physical world. We speak of nature as though it were something outside U.S. forests, oceans, mountains, animals. But if atomism is correct, there is no strict boundary between humanity and nature at the deepest physical level. We are nature organized in a particular way. The food we eat becomes part of the body. The body changes continuously. Matter enters. Matter leaves. The arrangement changes, yet we continue to call ourselves the same person. This raises a deeper philosophical question. If everything physical is changing, what does it mean for something to remain the same? A tree can lose branches and grow new ones while remaining the same tree. A person changes physically throughout life while continuing to be recognized as the same individual. A river changes its water from moment to moment while retaining its name and form. Leucippus' philosophy encourages us to distinguish between the identity of an arrangement and the particular pieces temporarily participating in it. The form can remain recognizable even though its material components are changing. This is one of the great strengths of atomism. It gives us a way to think about stability without denying change. The world is neither completely fixed nor completely chaotic. There are enduring elements and changing arrangements. Atoms remain. Forms change. And because the atoms can combine in different ways, nature can produce extraordinary variety from relatively simple foundations. This is a philosophical vision of immense scale. The stars above us, the ground beneath us, the animals around us, and our own bodies all belong to the same physical order. The differences we see are real at the level of experience, but beneath them lies a common material foundation. This idea also encourages a particular kind of intellectual humility. Human beings are accustomed to judging reality by what appears directly to them. We see solid objects and naturally assume solidity is fundamental. We see colors and assume color exists exactly as we experience it. We see separate objects and assume their visible boundaries reveal the deepest structure of reality. Leucippus asks us to go further. The visible world may be only the surface of a much deeper process. What appears solid may contain enormous amounts of empty space. What appears still may consist of countless tiny movements. What appears to be a single object may be a temporary arrangement of many smaller bodies. The ordinary world is therefore not false. It is incomplete. There is more happening beneath appearances than our senses immediately reveal. This is why philosophical thinking requires more than simply looking. It requires asking what must be true for what we observe to be possible. If movement exists, what makes movement possible? If change exists, what remains through change? If objects can be divided, does division continue forever? Or must there eventually be something that cannot be divided? Leucippus chooses the second possibility. There must be limits to division. Otherwise, matter would never reach a stable foundation. The atom becomes that foundation. It cannot be broken down into smaller physical parts. It is not created. It is not destroyed. It simply participates in different arrangements. The universe, then, becomes a vast field of movement. Atoms moving through void, structures forming and dissolving, worlds emerging from combinations, forms disappearing as their arrangements break apart. Nothing needs to be created from absolute nothing. Nothing needs to disappear into absolute nothing. There is simply an endless transformation of what already exists. And once Leucippus has established this physical picture, an even deeper question begins to appear. If human beings are part of this natural order, and if nature operates through causes rather than wishes, what does that mean for human freedom? If our bodies belong to nature, if our thoughts arise within natural beings, if everything has physical causes, then how much control do we actually possess? This question will become one of the most difficult consequences of the Atomist view, because understanding the universe is one thing. Understanding our place within it is something much harder. Leucippus now reaches a difficult question that follows naturally from his picture of nature. If everything happens through the movement and interaction of physical bodies, where does human choice fit into such a world? The question is not whether people make decisions. Obviously we do. We choose where to go, what to say, what to pursue, and what to avoid. The deeper question is whether those choices stand completely outside the natural order, or whether they too arise from conditions that existed before the decision itself. Leucippus' philosophy leaves very little room for a universe in which events simply appear without causes. The movement of atoms is part of an ordered process. One arrangement produces conditions for another. What happens at one moment is connected to what came before. If human beings belong to this same nature, then our actions cannot be completely detached from it. Our bodies have conditions. Our senses receive impressions. Our minds respond to those impressions. Our habits influence our decisions. Our circumstances affect what choices seem possible. A person raised in one environment may develop very different expectations from someone raised in another. A person who has experienced danger may react differently to a situation than someone who has never encountered it. Knowledge changes judgment. Experience changes expectation. Repeated actions create habits. The decision may feel immediate, but it has a history. This does not make human thought meaningless. It makes it part of nature. That distinction is important. Leucippus does not need to imagine that human beings are machines in the crude modern sense. His philosophical problem is more basic. If nature is governed by causes, then human behavior must also have conditions that make it possible. This gives us another reason to examine ourselves carefully. We often describe our actions by saying, "I simply felt like doing it." But where did that feeling come from? Why did one thing attract us and another repel us? Why does the same criticism make one person angry and leave another completely calm? Why can one person resist a temptation that another finds impossible to ignore? There are histories behind these reactions. The body has one condition rather than another. The mind has one set of memories rather than another. The person has learned certain habits. They have developed particular expectations. What we call character may therefore be understood partly as the result of repeated patterns. This makes the formation of character extremely important. Even if Leucippus himself did not leave behind a developed ethical system, the natural philosophy he helped establish invites a serious examination of human behavior. If actions arise within nature, then changing the conditions that produce our actions can change the way we live. Habits matter. Education matters. Environment matters. The people around us matter. What we repeatedly expose ourselves to can influence what eventually feels normal. A person who constantly surrounds themselves with anger may become quicker to anger. Someone who spends years pursuing status may begin to measure everything through status. Someone who regularly studies difficult questions may become more comfortable with uncertainty. The mind is not isolated from the world. It is shaped through contact with it. This also helps explain why appearances can be misleading. We tend to think we know why another person acted as they did. Someone refuses a request, and we call them selfish. Someone becomes quiet, and we assume they are unfriendly. Someone succeeds, and we assume they are confident. But we rarely see all the causes. A person's visible action is the final point of a much longer chain. We see the movement. We do not see everything that produced it. The same principle applies to ourselves. We sometimes believe that our motives are completely transparent to us. Yet a person can convince themselves that they are acting from principle when pride is quietly influencing them. Someone may say they want success for a noble reason, while secretly craving recognition. Self-knowledge, therefore, requires patience. We have to examine not only what we do, but why we are drawn toward doing it. This is where philosophical thinking becomes more than a theory about atoms. It becomes a discipline of attention. The physical universe may operate through causes, but human beings have the ability to investigate those causes. We can ask what produces a reaction. We can identify habits. We can notice patterns. We can change some conditions. We cannot step outside nature, but we can understand more about our place within it. That understanding can also change how we think about misfortune. If something goes wrong, the natural response is often to ask, "Why did this happen to me?" Leucippus' worldview suggests a different question. What caused it? The difference is significant. The first question can easily become a search for personal meaning in every event. The second begins an investigation. A business fails. What conditions produce the failure? A friendship breaks down. What decisions led there? A person becomes unhealthy. What habits, circumstances, or physical causes contributed? A plan collapses. Which assumptions were wrong? This way of thinking does not remove emotional pain, but it can prevent helpless confusion from becoming permanent. Understanding causes gives us something to work with. Sometimes the cause cannot be changed. Sometimes it can. Knowing the difference is part of intelligence. Leucippus' philosophy also changes the way we think about the supernatural. If natural events have natural causes, then the unknown should not automatically be filled with invisible intentions. Human beings have a strong tendency to search for purpose. When something happens unexpectedly, we ask what it means. When suffering occurs, we often want to believe that it happened for a reason. But nature does not necessarily operate according to human ideas of intention. A storm does not have to be angry. An earthquake does not have to be warning anyone. A disease does not have to carry a moral message. Sometimes an event is simply the result of physical conditions. This can be uncomfortable because human beings prefer stories to uncertainty. A story gives events a beginning, a purpose, and an explanation that feels complete. Nature may offer something less comforting. It may simply offer causes. Leucippus' naturalism asks us to tolerate that discomfort. We should not invent an explanation merely because uncertainty is unpleasant. Better to say, "We do not know yet." That sentence may sound weak, but it is intellectually stronger than pretending to know. The search for causes also affects our understanding of necessity. If atoms move through the void according to their nature, then the world is not a collection of completely unrelated events. There is continuity between what happens before and what happens afterward. A falling object does not choose to fall. A stone does not decide where it will move. Physical bodies interact according to their conditions. Human beings are more complicated because we have perception, thought, memory, and desire. Yet even these belong to the natural world. This creates an important tension. We experience ourselves as choosing. Nature appears to operate through necessity. How can both be true? Leucippus does not leave us a complete surviving theory of free will, and very little of his original writing remains. We should therefore be careful about claiming more than the evidence allows. But the problem itself becomes unavoidable once atomism is taken seriously. If every event has a cause, then the human decision has causes too. Perhaps freedom does not mean being completely outside causation. Perhaps what matters is understanding the causes that shape us. A person who knows why they react in certain ways has more ability to change those reactions than someone who never examines them. Someone who recognizes their tendency toward anger can learn to pause. Someone who notices their dependence on approval can begin separating self-respect from public opinion. Someone who understands that certain environments constantly trigger destructive habits can change their surroundings. Knowledge may not make us independent of nature. It may make us more intelligent participants within nature. This is one of the most interesting possibilities opened by Leucippus' philosophy. We do not need to imagine freedom as magical independence from causes. We can understand human freedom more modestly, as the growing ability to understand ourselves and act with greater awareness of the forces influencing us. The more clearly we see the machinery of our own habits, the less blindly we follow them. That idea will become much more developed in later philosophy, but the foundations of the problem are already present here. Leucippus also gives us a powerful lesson about simplicity. The visible world is incredibly complicated. There are countless species, countless landscapes, countless objects, countless human lives. Yet behind this enormous variety, he searches for a small number of basic principles. Atoms, void, movement, combination, separation. From simple elements, complex forms can emerge. This is an important philosophical instinct. Do not multiply fundamental explanations unnecessarily. If many different things can be explained through a smaller number of principles, the simpler account may be more powerful. But simplicity does not mean that reality is easy. A simple foundation can produce enormous complexity. A few notes can produce countless melodies. A small number of letters can produce entire libraries. A limited set of physical components can form an enormous variety of structures. Leucippus sees nature in a similar way. The basic ingredients may be few. The combinations can be almost unimaginably many. This gives his philosophy an unusual balance. At the deepest level, reality is simple. At the level of experience, it is extraordinarily complex. We should not confuse the two. The fact that nature can be described through basic principles does not mean that individual lives are simple. Human beings remain complicated arrangements of physical processes, memories, relationships, and circumstances. Understanding the foundation does not immediately solve every problem, but it gives us a place to begin, and that is perhaps the greatest contribution of Leucippus. He teaches philosophy to ask what must exist beneath the changing surface of things. He does not accept that change requires magic. He does not accept that movement is impossible. He does not accept that every mystery must be explained through intention. He searches for a world that can be understood through matter, space, movement, and cause. Once that picture is accepted, the human being is no longer standing outside nature and looking in. We are inside it. Our bodies belong to it. Our thoughts arise within it. Our choices develop from conditions within it. Our lives are temporary arrangements within a much larger process. And that realization leads toward another question, perhaps the most human question of all. If we are temporary beings living inside a changing universe that we cannot completely control, what kind of life is worth building while we are here? Leucippus' philosophy becomes even more interesting when we consider what his view of nature does to our ordinary understanding of reality. We usually divide the world into separate things. This is a tree. That is a stone. This is a person. That is water. We give each thing a name and treat those names as if they describe permanent boundaries. But beneath these familiar divisions, Leucippus sees something very different. There are atoms moving through the void, coming together and separating again. The objects we recognize are temporary arrangements of these smaller realities. A tree is not an eternal thing called a tree. It is a particular organization of matter. A human body is another organization. A stone is another. When the arrangement changes enough, we give the result a different name. This means that the world of ordinary experience is a world of forms. Forms matter because they are what we live among, but they are not the deepest level of reality. The distinction is important because human beings often become attached to forms as though they were permanent. We become attached to a particular house, a particular position, a particular appearance, a particular relationship, even a particular image of ourselves. But nature does not preserve forms for our convenience. Everything we know is subject to alteration. The child becomes the adult. The healthy body becomes an aging body. A new building becomes an old building. A thriving city changes into something different over generations. Even the landscape itself slowly changes. Leucippus gives us a way to think about this without imagining that change is a destruction of reality itself. What changes is the arrangement. What exists at a deeper level continues through different forms. That distinction can be quietly profound. We often think that when something changes, it has somehow betrayed what it was supposed to be. But nature has no obligation to preserve a particular arrangement. Change is not a mistake in the system. It is what the system does. The atoms move. They meet. They separate. They form new structures. Those structures eventually break apart. And the process continues. There is something almost impersonal about this picture, but also something liberating. Nature does not have to be understood as a story in which every event has been designed around human expectations. It simply operates. That removes a certain kind of fear. If a natural event is not a personal message, then we do not need to spend our lives searching for hidden intentions behind every occurrence. We can investigate causes instead. This is especially important because fear grows easily in the presence of uncertainty. When people do not understand why something happened, the imagination often supplies an explanation. A strange event becomes an omen. A disaster becomes a punishment. An illness becomes evidence that someone has done something wrong. Leucippus' natural philosophy encourages resistance to this habit. Not everything has to be about us. Nature can produce events without having human purposes. A storm can be explained through natural conditions. A body can become sick through physical causes. A stone can fall because of its position and movement. The universe does not need to possess human intentions in order to be orderly. This is one of the great intellectual shifts represented by atomism. The search for explanation moves away from stories about invisible intentions and toward the structure of nature itself. What is something made of? How is it arranged? How does it move? What happens when it meets something else? What conditions are necessary for the result? These questions are simple, but they can lead very far. They also teach an important lesson about knowledge. What we see is not always enough. The senses give us the world as it appears to us. But appearance is only the beginning of investigation. We see a solid table. Atomism asks us to imagine what lies beneath that solidity. We see stillness. Atomism asks whether the smallest parts might be moving even when the larger object appears motionless. We see an object disappear. Atomism asks what happened to its components. We see one thing become another. Atomism asks which parts remained and which arrangements changed. The ordinary world becomes a surface that invites deeper questioning. This is not an invitation to distrust everything we experience. The senses are useful. Without them, we would have no observations from which to begin, but they should not be treated as the final judge of reality. The eye tells us how something looks. Reason asks what could make it look that way. That difference is at the heart of philosophical inquiry, and it also creates humility. We should be cautious about saying, "This is obviously how reality is," simply because something appears obvious. Human perception has limits. Our position in the universe is limited. Our lifespan is limited. Our knowledge is limited. Yet within those limits, we can still improve our understanding. That is enough. Leucippus' philosophy does not require complete knowledge before inquiry becomes worthwhile. We can know something without knowing everything. We can have a useful explanation while remaining open to correction. This is one of the healthiest attitudes a thinker can develop. The alternative is certainty without understanding. A person who cannot admit uncertainty becomes trapped by their own conclusions. A person who can say, "This is what the evidence suggests, but I may be missing something," remains capable of learning. The ancient Atomist approach encourages this second attitude. It is also significant that Leucippus tries to explain the enormous variety of the world through differences among basic physical bodies. The atoms are not all identical in every respect. They can differ in shape, size, arrangement, and position. Their combinations produce different structures. This means that complexity does not require an infinite number of basic ingredients. A limited set of fundamental possibilities can produce an extraordinary number of results. We can see something similar in language. There are relatively few letters, but they can form thousands of words and millions of sentences. The complexity of the final result does not require every sentence to have its own unique alphabet. The combinations create the variety. Leucippus sees nature in a comparable way. The basic elements can be few while their arrangements are almost endlessly diverse. This is a powerful idea because it changes the way we look at complexity. When we encounter something complicated, we do not necessarily need to assume that its foundation must also be complicated. Sometimes complexity emerges from simple things interacting in complicated ways. This idea reaches far beyond ancient atomism. It encourages us to search for structure. Instead of memorizing every individual phenomenon, look for the principles that connect them. Instead of asking why every object is completely different, ask what they share. Instead of treating every event as isolated, ask what pattern links them. Leucippus' philosophy is therefore not merely a claim about tiny particles. It is a way of looking. Look for what remains beneath change. Look for the conditions that produce events. Look for common principles beneath apparent variety. And do not confuse the appearance of a thing with the whole of its reality. These habits also affect the way we understand ourselves. If the human being is part of nature, then we should not imagine ourselves as completely separate from the physical world. Our bodies are made from matter. They change continuously. We depend upon food, air, temperature, movement, and countless other physical conditions. Our thoughts do not occur in some completely isolated realm detached from the body. Even before later philosophers developed detailed theories of mind, the materialist direction of atomism challenged the idea that human beings require a completely separate kind of substance simply to belong to nature. This makes the human being both special and ordinary. We are special because we can reflect upon existence. We can ask what reality is. We can wonder about the structure of matter. We can examine our own beliefs, but we are ordinary in the sense that we remain part of the natural order. We are not outside the universe looking down upon it. We are inside it. This can change the way we think about our own importance. Human beings naturally place themselves at the center of things. Our personal problems feel enormous. Our ambitions feel urgent. Our successes feel significant. Our disappointments can seem like disasters. But Leucippus' universe is unimaginably larger than any individual life. The atoms existed before us. The physical world does not begin with our birth. It does not end with our death. We are temporary participants in something much larger. That realization does not have to produce despair. It can produce proportion. A small problem can remain a problem without becoming the whole universe. An insult can hurt without defining an entire life. A failed plan can be disappointing without becoming proof that life has no value. A period of difficulty can be real without being permanent. The world is larger than the moment we are currently experiencing. This sense of proportion becomes particularly important when thinking about death. Leucippus' atomism naturally challenges the idea that death means matter becoming nothing. The arrangement that constitutes a living person eventually breaks apart. The individual form ends, but the physical components continue within nature. The atoms do not need to disappear simply because the person does. From this perspective, death is a change in organization that does not answer every emotional question about mortality. Philosophy cannot make the loss of someone we love feel insignificant, but it can challenge certain mistaken ideas about what physical death means. Nature is not constantly creating matter from nothing and then destroying it into nothing. Forms arise and forms disappear. The underlying physical reality continues. This also changes our relationship with permanence. Perhaps we suffer partly because we expect the world to hold still for us. We want our bodies to remain young, our relationships to remain unchanged, our circumstances to remain secure, our achievements to remain recognized. But the philosophy of atomism makes permanence a strange expectation. Everything visible is arrangement. Every arrangement can change. The wise response is not to stop caring. It is to care without demanding impossibility. Love someone without pretending you can keep them forever. Enjoy a place without assuming it will never change. Value your health without imagining that it is guaranteed. Work toward something without believing that success can make you permanently secure. This is not began with a problem that had troubled Greek philosophy, and realism can sometimes be more peaceful. How can anything change? False certainty. It sounds like an ordinary question. Also reminds us that explanations should be a tree that is small becomes large. A seed very little of his own writing. Water becomes vapor. So much of what we know about him comes through later reports, of wood can be cut, and the development of atomism by others, scattered and transformed. Especially Democritus. A person who is young makes intellectual caution everywhere we look important. Things appear to move. We should not invent an elaborate personal philosophy. But what exactly is happening when something changes does not support is the new thing. His importance lies primarily in the radical. Was it already there in some associated with his name? And if nothing can come from nothing, void. How can genuine change? The attempt to explain change. Leucippus entered philosophy through that foundation would become, and his answer would become one of the most consequential ideas. Later philosophers would criticize reality. He proposed consists of indivisible bodies or combined parts of it through empty space. But the basic challenge remained powerful. It is a deceptively simple sentence. What if the world does not behind it lies an attempt to solve one of the deepest logical problems faced by the ancient Greeks? What if change can be understood through rearrangement? And what makes Leucippus particularly fascinating is that almost nothing certain. What if nature can be explained through physical causes? Even his existence was questioned. These questions changed the direction some ancient writers treated him. And perhaps the most remarkable part, others associated little Leucippus so strongly with his better-known student Democritus. He did not begin by giving every Leucippus almost disappeared behind his own intellectual legacy. He searched for a small number of fundamental later generations would remember Democritus could be far more clearly. Atoms, but before there could be Democritus the Atomist, there was Leucippus, Separation, and the surviving fragments attributed to him from these simple ideas to reveal the extraordinary philosophical in which his thought begins to unfold. The philosophical and once we see ourselves had already temporary arrangements divided that over the nature of reality. The final question, one of the most powerful challenges, came from Parmenides. How should a person live? Parmenides had argued that what truly is cannot simply come into existence, and when even their own existence, if something comes into being, that is where the physical philosophy of Leucippus, if it came from what exists, begins to touch the deepest questions of. If it came from what does not exist, then something would have to emerge from nothing. But absolute nothingness cannot provide anything. So genuine coming to be seemed impossible. The same problem appeared in reverse. If something ceases to exist completely, where does it go? It cannot become nothing, because nothing is not a thing into which something can turn. The argument was devastating, and it created an enormous philosophical challenge. Our senses tell us that things change constantly, but reason seemed to suggest that genuine change was impossible. The world of ordinary experience appeared to contradict the demands of logic. Leucippus did not simply ignore this contradiction. He tried to solve it. His solution was radical. Perhaps things do not literally come into existence from nothing. Perhaps they are formed by combinations of things that already exist. And perhaps things do not literally disappear into nothing. Perhaps their components separate. Think of a house. A house can be built, but the materials from which it is constructed were not created at the moment the house appeared. What already existed? Stone already existed. Metal already existed. The builders simply arranged these materials in a particular way. Later, the house can collapse. But its materials do not have to vanish from reality. They can become part of something else. Leucippus extended this principle to the entire physical universe. What appears to us as creation and destruction may actually be combination and separation. What appears to be birth may be a new arrangement. What appears to be death may be the dissolution of an arrangement. What appears to be transformation may be movement beneath the level of ordinary perception. This allowed him to preserve something important from the arguments of Parmenides, while also explaining the obvious fact that change occurs. There is no need for something to emerge from absolute nothing. There is no need for something to disappear into absolute nothing. Instead, fundamental realities persist while their arrangements change. But this raises another question. What are these fundamental realities? If we keep dividing matter, can we continue forever? Take a stone. Break it in half. Take one half and break it again. Continue. The imagination can keep performing the operation. But Leucippus proposed that there must eventually be a limit. There must be bodies that cannot be divided any further. These were the atoms. The word itself comes from the Greek idea of something uncuttable or indivisible. They were not merely extremely small pieces of ordinary matter. They were the basic physical units from which the visible world was constructed. And here Leucippus made another extraordinary move. Atoms could differ from one another. They could have different shapes and arrangements. They could move through empty space. When they came together in particular ways, they produced the objects we experience. When they separated, those objects could disappear. The world we see was therefore not composed of countless fundamentally different substances. Its enormous variety could emerge from differences in the basic constituents and their arrangements. This was an astonishing simplification. Imagine having thousands of different objects in front of you. A cup, a tree, a mountain, a human body, a piece of iron, a cloud. Instead of assuming that each requires a completely different fundamental substance, Leucippus asked whether the apparent diversity could arise from a smaller number of basic elements arranged differently. It was a profoundly reductionist way of thinking, and yet it did not make the world less interesting. It made the problem more interesting, because now the philosopher could ask not merely what something looks like, but how its underlying structure produces that appearance. This distinction between appearance and underlying reality would become one of the great themes of ancient philosophy. Our senses show us a world filled with colors, tastes, smells, sounds, textures, heat, and cold. But if the fundamental constituents of reality are atoms, then perhaps these qualities are not present in matter exactly as they appear to us. Perhaps they arise from interactions between physical structures and our senses. Leucippus was therefore beginning to separate two questions. What does something appear to be? And what must reality be like for that appearance to occur? That second question is much harder, and it requires reason to move beyond immediate experience. But Leucippus needed one more ingredient for his system to work. Void. Empty space. This was perhaps just as controversial as the atoms themselves. If everything that exists is filled with something, where can movement occur? Imagine a universe completely packed with matter. There would be no empty interval between one thing and another. No room for one body to move away from another. No space into which anything could travel. Yet movement is undeniable. We see objects move constantly. So Leucippus argued that empty space must exist. There must be a void through which atoms can move. This was philosophically explosive because many thinkers had difficulty accepting that what is not a body could somehow have a role in reality. But Leucippus was willing to make the distinction. The void is not another material substance. It is the absence of matter. And precisely because there is empty space, bodies can move. This gave him a physical explanation for change. Atoms do not need to be created whenever something new appears. They move. They collide. They separate. They combine. Their arrangements produce the constantly changing world of experience. The universe therefore becomes a gigantic process of rearrangement. There is no need to imagine that every event requires a new substance to appear from nowhere. There is no need for matter to vanish into absolute nothingness. There are persistent physical constituents moving through an immense void. This was a daring attempt to explain the world using as few assumptions as possible. But Leucippus did not stop with physical objects. His theory had consequences for the entire structure of nature. If the visible world emerges from atoms and their movements, then perhaps the heavens themselves can be understood through natural processes. The stars, the planets, the earth, the formation of worlds, the destruction of worlds. Instead of treating every cosmic event as the direct result of divine intention, Leucippus opened the possibility that the universe could operate according to physical principles. This was an enormous intellectual shift. It meant that the philosopher did not always have to ask which god was responsible for a phenomenon. The philosopher could ask what physical process produced it. That does not make Leucippus a modern scientist. He had none of the experimental methods, instruments, mathematics, or empirical evidence that would later transform our understanding of matter. His atomism was a philosophical hypothesis, but the style of reasoning was extraordinary. Begin with a logical problem. Examine what must be true if change is possible. Construct a model of invisible reality that can explain visible phenomena. Then use that model to understand increasingly complicated aspects of nature. This was philosophy functioning almost like a primitive theoretical science. And it began with one deceptively simple realization. The world may not be fundamentally the way it looks. What appears to be solid may contain emptiness. What appears to be created may be newly arranged. What appears to be destroyed may simply be dispersed. What appears to be a single object may actually be a temporary organization of countless smaller realities. Once Leucippus opened this door, an entirely different picture of existence became possible. Reality was no longer a collection of permanent visible things. It was movement, structure, combination, separation, an enormous dance of invisible bodies through the void. And if that was true of stones and stars, another question inevitably followed. What about us? Are human beings also temporary arrangements? Are our bodies governed by the same natural principles? What about sensation, thought, desire, fear? And if the human being is part of the same physical universe, what happens to our traditional ideas about the soul, the gods, and human purpose? Leucippus had begun by trying to solve the problem of change, but his solution was quietly opening a much larger question. If nature can be explained through matter and motion, perhaps the human being must also be understood as part of nature. And that possibility would become one of the most radical consequences of the Atomist philosophy. Leucippus' atomism becomes even more remarkable when we realize that he was not simply proposing a strange theory about tiny particles. He was trying to construct an entirely different picture of reality, one in which the things we experience every day could be explained without assuming that nature is constantly creating and destroying existence itself. The key was motion. For Leucippus, the universe was not a static collection of objects. It was an immense field of movement. Atoms were constantly traveling through the void, encountering one another, separating, combining, and forming temporary arrangements. What we call an object was therefore not necessarily something permanent in itself. It was a particular organization of more fundamental things. This changes the way we think about ordinary objects. Take a human body. From the outside, it appears to be one continuous thing. We give it a name. We recognize it from one day to the next. We say that this is the same person. But from the Atomist perspective, the body is an organized structure. It is not a single indivisible substance. It is a temporary arrangement. The same principle can be applied to a tree, a river, a mountain, or an entire city. A city seems permanent when we live inside it, but buildings are constructed and demolished. People are born and die. Streets are rebuilt. Institutions change. Generations replace generations. The name may remain while almost everything beneath the name changes. Leucippus' philosophy encourages us to look beyond the label and toward the underlying process. What appears stable may actually be something continuously changing. That insight was especially important because ancient philosophers were struggling with the problem of becoming. If things genuinely change, then what exactly is the relationship between what something was and what it becomes? The Atomist answer was elegant. The fundamental atoms remain. Their arrangements change. A new object can appear without new matter being created. An old object can disappear without matter being annihilated. This means that what we call birth and death can be understood as processes of composition and separation. That idea would later become central to the Atomist tradition associated with Democritus and, centuries afterward, Epicurus. But Leucippus' contribution was more than simply saying that tiny particles exist. He was developing a framework in which change itself could be understood mechanically. Suppose two groups of atoms are separated. Then, through motion, they come together. They form a new arrangement. To our senses, something new has appeared. But at the fundamental level, Nothing has emerged from absolute nothingness. The pieces were already there. Only the arrangement was new. Then suppose the arrangement breaks apart. The object disappears from our experience. But again, the underlying components have not simply fallen into nothing. They have been redistributed. This allowed Leucippus to preserve permanence at the fundamental level while explaining change at the visible level. The distinction is subtle, but enormously powerful. The world can change without reality being created from nothing. Things can disappear without existence itself disappearing. Everything we see can be temporary, while something more fundamental remains. This also explains why the void was indispensable. Without empty space, atoms could not rearrange themselves. If reality were completely packed with matter, there would be nowhere for anything to move. But if void exists, then atoms can travel through it. They can approach, they can separate, they can form different configurations. The universe becomes dynamic. And this gave Leucippus a way to explain something that seems obvious to us, but was philosophically difficult for the ancient Greeks. Motion. We see a person walking, a stone falling, a ship crossing the sea, clouds moving across the sky. But what makes movement possible? Leucippus' answer was not simply that objects possess the mysterious ability to move. He provided a setting in which movement becomes physically possible. There is matter. There is space, and matter moves through space. From this, increasingly complex arrangements can emerge. This way of thinking also encouraged Leucippus to reject the assumption that every event needs a personal intention behind it. When a tree grows, we do not necessarily need to imagine that a separate supernatural decision is being made every moment. The process can arise from the properties of natural bodies and their interactions. When a stone falls, we can search for a physical explanation. When a fire spreads, we can examine the material conditions. When the heavens move, we can investigate their structure. This does not mean that Leucippus possessed correct explanations for all these phenomena. He did not. His cosmology was speculative, and many of its details were eventually shown to be wrong. But the underlying attitude was important. Nature should be understandable through nature. The universe does not have to be interpreted as a series of isolated miracles. It can be investigated as an ordered system. This was a profound change in intellectual temperament, and it also affected how Leucippus understood necessity. The Atomists believed that events arise from the movements and interactions of physical bodies rather than from arbitrary divine decisions. Ancient reports associate Leucippus with the idea that nothing happens without a reason, but the surviving evidence is extremely limited, and scholars continue to debate exactly how his conception of necessity should be understood. Still, the direction is clear. The universe was not being imagined as a place where events simply happen without any underlying structure. There were causes. There were physical interactions. There was an intelligible order. This idea would eventually become one of the great foundations of natural philosophy. If an event has a cause, then perhaps that cause can be investigated. If the cause can be investigated, then perhaps similar causes produce similar effects. And if patterns can be discovered, knowledge becomes possible. The world stops being merely mysterious. It becomes a problem that can be studied. This confidence in intelligibility was one of Leucippus' greatest contributions. But his theory created another enormous question. If everything is made from atoms moving according to natural processes, what happens to human consciousness? At first, this may seem like a completely separate problem, but it is not. Human beings experience thoughts, emotions, sensations, memories, dreams, desires, and fears. Where do these come from? If the body is physical, perhaps the mind must also have some connection to physical reality. The Atomists moved in precisely this direction. Ancient testimony suggests that they regarded the soul as material, composed of especially fine and mobile atoms. These atoms were thought to be particularly suited to movement and connected with the activities of life. The soul was therefore not necessarily a completely separate substance floating outside the physical universe. It belonged to nature. That was a radical idea. For many ancient thinkers, the soul represented something fundamentally different from ordinary matter. The Atomists instead asked whether what we call soul might itself be part of the material order. This opened the possibility that life, sensation, and thought could eventually be investigated through natural explanations. Again, Leucippus did not possess modern neuroscience. He could not explain neurons' electrical signals, neurotransmitters, or the architecture of the brain. But the philosophical question had changed. Instead of asking whether the mind is exempt from nature, the Atomist could ask how mental life emerges within nature. That question would remain alive for thousands of years, and it becomes even more interesting when connected to perception. If everything we experience is produced by physical interactions, then perception is not a transparent window through which the mind simply looks at reality. There must be a process. Objects affect our senses. Our senses are affected physically. Those effects produce experiences. This means that the world we experience is partly shaped by the interaction between the external world and our own constitution. The sweetness of honey, the color of the sky, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of a voice. All of these experiences involve the meeting of external reality with a perceiving organism. That distinction between the world and our experience of the world would become fundamental to later philosophy. Leucippus helped create the conditions for asking it. But there was another consequence. If perception can differ from underlying reality, then human beings must learn to be careful with appearances. Something can look permanent while being temporary. Something can look simple while being enormously complex. Something can appear empty while containing hidden structure. Something can seem obvious while requiring deeper explanation. This creates a philosophical discipline of suspicion. Do not reject what the senses tell you, but do not assume that the senses have told you everything. Look deeper. Ask what must be happening beneath the appearance. This is perhaps the most modern quality in Leucippus' thought. He was willing to imagine entities that no human being could directly see because they provided a possible explanation for what human beings could see. That is a crucial intellectual move. Science would later depend upon it constantly. We cannot directly see many of the structures that explain the visible world. We infer them from effects. We construct models. We test consequences. We revise them. Leucippus had no modern experimental system, but the philosophical imagination required for this kind of reasoning was already present. And yet his philosophy was not only about matter. Once we begin understanding the universe as a world of temporary arrangements, another question naturally appears. How should human beings respond to the fact that they too are temporary? If the body is an arrangement of atoms, if the soul is also connected to physical processes, if death means the dissolution of the organization that makes an individual alive, then the fear of death needs to be reconsidered. This would become especially important in later Atomist ethics. The point was not that death is pleasant. The point was that death should be understood naturally. A person is born. Their physical organization develops. They experience the world. They think. They love. They suffer. They learn. And eventually the organization breaks apart. The atoms do not need to vanish, but the particular individual arrangement does. From this perspective, death is not the transformation of a living person into an eternal state of suffering. It is the end of a particular organization. This idea would later be developed much more fully by Epicurus, but its roots reach back to the Atomist tradition. And this gives Leucippus' philosophy an unexpected human dimension. He began with a question about matter, but his answer changed the way one might think about fear. If nature operates through understandable processes, then perhaps human beings do not need to live in terror of every unexplained event. If death is part of nature, perhaps we can understand mortality rather than constantly imagining it as a supernatural threat. If the world changes through natural processes, perhaps we can stop interpreting every loss as a cosmic punishment. And if our lives are temporary arrangements within a much larger universe, perhaps we should spend less time demanding permanence from things that were never permanent. This does not make life less valuable. It can make the present more valuable. The meal is temporary. The conversation is temporary. Friendship is temporary. Youth is temporary. Health is temporary. Even the civilization around us is temporary. But temporary does not mean worthless. It means that value exists within time. Leucippus' physical theory, therefore, quietly prepares the ground for a philosophy of impermanence. We are part of a universe in motion. We cannot freeze it. We cannot command it to preserve what we love. We can only understand as much as we are able, live intelligently within the conditions we have been given, and recognize that every form we encounter is part of a larger process. This was the extraordinary world opened by atomism. Behind the visible world was an invisible one. Behind apparent stability was motion. Behind apparent creation was combination. Behind apparent destruction was separation. And behind the enormous complexity of nature were simpler physical principles waiting to be understood. Leucippus had taken an ancient philosophical problem and given it a completely new direction. The world does change, but change does not require reality itself to appear from nothing. There can be permanent constituents and temporary arrangements. There can be matter and void. There can be order without constant supernatural intervention. And there can be an intelligible natural world that the human mind is capable of investigating. But once this picture had been established, the most difficult question remained. If human beings themselves belong to this physical universe, what does that mean for freedom? Are our choices also part of a chain of natural events? If every movement has a cause, can a person genuinely choose? And if the mind is material, what exactly makes one human life different from another? These questions would become some of the deepest problems inherited by the Atomist tradition, and they would force philosophy to move beyond the structure of matter toward the mystery of human action itself. The question of human freedom becomes especially difficult once Leucippus has reduced the universe to matter, motion, and void. If everything that exists is part of nature, and if everything that happens has some physical explanation, then what about a human decision? When a person chooses to speak, remain silent, leave a place, forgive someone, become angry, or resist an impulse, is that genuinely a free act? Or is the choice itself simply another event in nature, produced by previous conditions that the person did not choose? Leucippus lived long before this problem was formulated in the language of modern neuroscience or determinism, but the tension is already present inside atomism. The human being is not standing outside the universe and commanding it from some separate realm. The human being belongs to the universe. Our bodies are physical. Our senses depend upon physical processes. Our emotions arise within embodied life. Our thoughts occur within a natural organism. If that is true, then human action must also have a place within the natural order. This does not make human life meaningless. It changes what we mean by understanding ourselves. A person may believe that a decision appeared mysteriously from nowhere. But Leucippus would encourage us to look for what produced it. Your character has a history. Your habits have a history. Your fears have a history. Your desires have a history. Your surroundings influence you. Your body influences you. Your experiences influence you. The people you have known influence you. Even the things you barely remember can leave traces in the way you respond to the world. A decision that feels instantaneous may therefore be the final expression of a much longer process. This is one of the profound implications of naturalistic philosophy. The human being becomes something that can be investigated. Instead of simply saying, "I am this way because that is who I am," we can begin asking why. Why does this person become angry so quickly? Why does another remain calm? Why does one desire recognition while another barely cares about it? Why does one person fear uncertainty while another finds it exciting? What experiences shape these differences? What habits strengthen them? What physical and social conditions sustain them? These questions transform the study of human nature. The individual becomes a phenomenon within nature. And once human behavior can be investigated, the possibility of self-understanding becomes much greater. You can begin to notice patterns in yourself. You can notice that certain situations repeatedly produce the same reaction. You can discover that a desire becomes weaker when it is examined carefully. You can discover that fear often grows when imagination is allowed to run without evidence. You can discover that anger sometimes protects an injured sense of pride rather than responding to genuine injustice. This kind of observation is philosophical in the deepest sense. The philosopher is not merely collecting theories about the universe. The philosopher is learning how the human being actually works. The Atomists were particularly important because they challenged the tendency to divide reality into completely separate worlds. There was not one set of rules for stones and another for bodies and another for the heavens and another for the soul. Nature was one interconnected order. That did not mean everything behaved in exactly the same way. A living organism is vastly more complex than a stone. A human mind is vastly more complex than a pile of sand. But complexity does not require a completely different kind of reality. A complicated structure can emerge from simpler components. This is one of the great conceptual strengths of atomism. You do not need to explain every complex thing by inventing a unique substance. You can ask how complexity emerges. A single atom is simple. A collection of atoms arranged in a particular structure can be extraordinarily complicated. The same principle appears everywhere in nature. Individual components can interact to create properties that are not obvious from looking at one component alone. The ancient Atomists could not express this with the mathematics of modern complexity theory, but their basic intuition was powerful. The whole depends upon the organization of its parts. This idea also helps explain why Leucippus' philosophy was so different from explanations based primarily on purpose. When we look at an eye, for example, it is tempting to say that it exists in order to see. When we look at a tree, we might speak of its purpose. When we look at the stars, we might imagine that they were placed there for human beings to contemplate. The Atomist approach asks a different question. What physical processes could produce this structure? How did these components come together? What conditions allow the structure to continue? The emphasis moves from purpose toward mechanism. That distinction would eventually become enormously important in the development of scientific thought. But it also creates a difficult philosophical problem. If nature has no human-centered purpose built into it, then where do human purposes come from? Why do we care about anything? Why should one life be considered better than another? Why should we seek knowledge? Why should we value friendship? Why should we avoid cruelty? The physical description of reality does not automatically answer these questions. Knowing what something is made of does not by itself tell us what we ought to do. This is where later Atomists, especially Democritus and Epicurus, developed ethical conclusions from the physical picture. Leucippus himself left very little material, so we have to be careful not to place every later ethical doctrine directly into his mouth. What we can say is that his natural philosophy created the conceptual environment in which such questions could be approached without relying entirely on supernatural explanations. And that was already revolutionary. If human beings are natural creatures, then perhaps human happiness can be investigated naturally. What conditions make people flourish? What produces fear? What produces contentment? What kinds of desires create suffering? What kinds of relationships make life better? What happens when people misunderstand their own needs? These are questions that can be observed in ordinary human life. The philosopher does not have to wait for a revelation from beyond nature. There is another consequence of this naturalistic picture that deserves attention. It changes the meaning of ignorance. When people do not understand something, they often fill the gap with imagination. A strange illness appears. A terrible storm arrives. A person dies unexpectedly. A crop fails. The human mind naturally searches for an explanation. But when knowledge is limited, explanation can become superstition. Something frightening happens, and the mind invents an invisible agent behind it. Leucippus' approach offers another possibility. Admit that you do not know, then investigate. This sounds simple, but intellectual humility is difficult. Human beings prefer a confident explanation to an honest uncertainty. We often feel safer believing a wrong answer than admitting that we do not understand. The Atomist tradition encouraged a different habit. Reality does not owe us immediate explanations. Our ignorance does not mean that nature is irrational. It may simply mean that we have not yet understood the mechanism. This attitude is one of the reasons ancient atomism feels unexpectedly modern. The world does not need to conform to our intuitions. Our intuitions must be tested against reality. Consider the solid objects around you. A table appears completely solid. You place your hand on it and feel resistance. To ordinary experience, there is no reason to suspect anything strange. Yet Leucippus imagined that solidity itself could emerge from invisible particles and empty space. The world we touch could therefore be fundamentally different from the world presented directly to the senses. That is an astonishing act of imagination, and it demonstrates something essential about philosophy. Sometimes the most important ideas begin by refusing to stop at what seems obvious. The obvious answer may be useful. It may even be correct at the everyday level. But philosophy asks whether it remains sufficient when we investigate more deeply. A table is solid for practical purposes. But what is solidity? A body moves through space. But what is space? A person experiences pain. But what is pain? A person thinks. But what is thought? A person dies. But what exactly has ended? These questions emerge naturally once the boundary between appearance and underlying structure has been opened. Leucippus therefore helped move philosophy toward a layered understanding of reality. There is the world as it appears, and there is the deeper physical organization that makes those appearances possible. This distinction also affects knowledge itself. If our senses provide only partial information, then reason becomes indispensable. But reason cannot simply invent whatever it wants. It must remain connected to experience. This balance is important. Pure sensation is insufficient because appearances can mislead. Pure speculation is also dangerous because the mind can construct elegant theories that have no connection to reality. The challenge is to use observation and reasoning together. Leucippus' surviving philosophy is too fragmentary to reconstruct a complete scientific method, but this tension between sensory evidence and rational explanation is central to the Atomist project. They were trying to explain what could be observed by proposing what could not directly be observed. That required disciplined imagination, not fantasy. A model that explains something is valuable because it connects hidden structure with visible consequences. This is the beginning of theoretical thinking. And once the Atomist picture is applied to the heavens, the scale of the philosophy becomes enormous. The Earth is no longer necessarily the center of a universe arranged specifically around human existence. It becomes one physical structure among many. Worlds can form. Worlds can change. Worlds can perish. The heavens themselves become part of nature. This possibility strips the cosmos of some of its traditional anthropocentrism. Human beings are no longer the obvious center of everything. We are inhabitants of a much larger physical reality. That realization can feel frightening, but it can also be liberating. If the universe is not arranged around our personal importance, then we do not need to interpret every event as being about us. A storm is not necessarily a message. A failure is not necessarily cosmic punishment. A success is not necessarily evidence that the universe has chosen us. Nature is larger than our individual stories. This creates a form of intellectual humility. The universe does not have to validate our expectations. We must learn to understand it on its own terms. And that same humility can be applied to human relationships. We often imagine that other people should behave according to our expectations. When they do not, we become angry. But if every person is a complex natural being shaped by their own history, desires, fears, and circumstances, then understanding becomes more useful than immediate judgment. This does not mean excusing harmful behavior. It means trying to understand causes before assuming motives. The more clearly we understand why something happens, the more intelligently we can respond to it. That is the deeper promise of natural philosophy. Understanding can replace unnecessary fear. It can replace superstition. It can replace impulsive judgment. It can even reduce hatred. Because once behavior is seen as something with causes, the question changes from what kind of monster is this, to what produced this behavior and what can be done about it. This way of thinking does not remove moral responsibility. It makes responsibility more complicated and more intelligent. Leucippus left no grand, surviving ethical system comparable to the later writings of Aristotle or the Stoics. His philosophical legacy is narrower and, in another sense, more foundational. He helped establish a picture of nature in which physical reality could be understood through fundamental constituents, motion and void. From that starting point, later thinkers could ask increasingly difficult questions about life, consciousness, ethics, and freedom. Democritus would expand the system. Epicurus would transform it into a philosophy of tranquil living. Lucretius would later give atomism one of its most beautiful literary expressions. Centuries after them, early modern thinkers would rediscover and reinterpret the idea of indivisible matter. And eventually modern science would develop a completely different and vastly more sophisticated understanding of matter. But the ancient question would remain recognizable. What lies beneath appearances? That question is still at the heart of science. We cannot directly see every structure responsible for the world we experience. We infer, we measure, we calculate, we test, we construct models, and sometimes the hidden reality turns out to be stranger than anything ordinary perception could have suggested. Leucippus had already taken the first philosophical step toward that realization. The visible world is not necessarily the deepest world. A thing may appear continuous while being composed of smaller structures. A world may appear stable while being in constant motion. A change may appear to create something new while actually reorganizing what already existed. And a human being may appear to be completely separate from nature while actually being one of nature's most complex temporary arrangements. Once we understand this, even the ordinary experience of being alive becomes different. You are not a permanent object placed inside a changing universe. You are yourself part of the change. Your body is continuously undergoing processes. Your thoughts change. Your moods change. Your beliefs change. Your relationships change. The person you were 10 years ago and the person you are now are connected, but they are not identical in every respect. You are an ongoing process. And perhaps that is why Leucippus' ancient idea feels so unexpectedly close to something we recognize today. Stability can be real without being absolute. Identity can exist without permanence. A river remains a river while its water moves. A person remains recognizably themselves while their body and mind undergo continual change. A city remains a city while generations replace one another. An object remains an object while its microscopic structure is constantly in motion. Reality does not need to be frozen in order to be intelligible. It can be dynamic, it can be changing, and yet it can still possess structure. This may be the deepest insight contained within the Atomist worldview. Change and order are not opposites. Movement does not necessarily mean chaos. A world in motion can still be governed by patterns. And if patterns exist, then understanding is possible. That conviction is what gives Leucippus' philosophy its enduring power. He looked at a world that seemed full of birth and death, growth and decay, creation and destruction. Instead of concluding that reality was impossible to understand, he searched for something beneath the changing surface. He imagined tiny bodies. He imagined empty space. He imagined motion. And from those simple ideas, he attempted to explain the enormous complexity of existence. But there was still one final problem. If everything is made from atoms moving through the void, if the human being is part of the same physical order, if nature does not revolve around our desires, then what should we do with the strange gift of consciousness? How should we live once we understand that we are temporary? How should we face desire, fear, pleasure, suffering, friendship, and death? Those questions would become the human heart of the Atomist tradition. And although Leucippus gave us only fragments, the path he opened would lead directly toward a much larger philosophy of human freedom, happiness, and mortality. The philosophy of Leucippus reaches its most important point when we stop looking at the atoms themselves and ask what his vision of nature does to our understanding of human existence. The world he imagined was enormous, impersonal, and constantly moving. Atoms traveled through the void. They met, separated, combined, and formed temporary structures. The things we experience as solid and permanent were not permanent at the deepest level. They were arrangements within a much larger process, and human beings belonged to that process. This was perhaps the most unsettling consequence of atomism. We are accustomed to thinking of ourselves as somehow standing apart from nature. We look at mountains, rivers, animals, and stars and call them the natural world. Then we look at ourselves and often imagine something different, something exceptional, something that does not belong to the same order. Leucippus offered no comfortable separation. The human body belongs to nature. Life belongs to nature. Sensation belongs to nature. And if thought is connected with the physical organization of the living being, then thought too belongs to nature. This does not reduce human life to something worthless. It does something much more interesting. It makes human life understandable. Instead of treating every thought and emotion as an inexplicable mystery, we can ask what produces them. Instead of assuming that fear is a message from the universe, we can ask what causes fear. Instead of assuming that desire is automatically a guide to what is good, we can ask why particular desires arise and whether following them actually improves our lives. This is where the Atomist tradition would eventually develop into a philosophy of psychological freedom. The first step toward freedom is understanding what controls you. A person who believes every desire must be obeyed is not free. They may believe they are choosing, but if every impulse commands them, then the impulse is their master. A person who becomes angry every time they are insulted may believe their anger proves strength. But if another person's words can instantly control their emotional state, there's a kind of dependence there. A person who cannot enjoy life without luxury becomes dependent upon luxury. A person who cannot feel worthy without praise becomes dependent upon praise. A person who cannot tolerate uncertainty becomes dependent upon control. The ancient Atomist picture encourages us to examine these dependencies rather than simply obey them. This does not mean suppressing every desire. It means understanding desire. There is a difference between wanting something and needing it psychologically. There is a difference between enjoying pleasure and being ruled by pleasure. There is a difference between possessing something and believing that you cannot be happy without possessing it. These distinctions became especially important in the later development of Atomist ethics. Democritus would place great emphasis on tranquility and moderation. Epicurus would eventually build an entire philosophy around the careful management of desire and the removal of unnecessary fear. But the intellectual foundation had already been prepared. Once nature is understood as a system of physical processes, human suffering can also be examined as something with causes. A person who fears death can ask what exactly they are afraid of. A person who constantly wants more can ask where that dissatisfaction comes from. A person consumed by envy can ask why another person's success feels like a personal loss. A person overwhelmed by anxiety can ask which part of their suffering comes from actual events and which part comes from imagined possibilities. This is a philosophical form of investigation. The mind becomes an object of inquiry, and that is a profound shift. Instead of simply believing whatever appears inside consciousness, we begin examining consciousness itself. What is this desire? Where did it come from? What does it promise? What does it actually deliver? Why does satisfaction disappear so quickly? Why does the mind immediately create another goal? Why does comparison make one person's success feel like another person's failure? These questions lead us away from the automatic life. And perhaps this is one of the deepest things we can take from Leucippus. A human being should not merely experience life. A human being should attempt to understand the processes that produce their experience. That is what philosophy can do. It creates a small distance between the person and the impulse. Instead of saying, "I am angry," the mind can ask, "What produced this anger?" Instead of saying, "I need this," it can ask, "Why do I believe I need it?" Instead of saying, "I am afraid," it can ask, "What exactly am I imagining?" That distance is the beginning of reflection, and reflection creates possibilities that impulse does not. This is also why the atomist rejection of supernatural explanations mattered so much. Ancient people lived in a world filled with uncertainty. Disease could arrive suddenly. Storms could destroy crops. Earthquakes could kill without warning. Children could die young. Empires could collapse. A person could lose everything through a single turn of fortune. When people cannot explain such events, they naturally search for intention. Someone must have caused this. Someone must be angry. Someone must be rewarding us. Someone must be punishing us. But the atomist worldview offered another possibility. Nature does not have to be interpreted through human intention. Events can arise from physical causes. This does not make suffering pleasant. It makes suffering intelligible. And understanding can change fear. If thunder is the anger of a god, then every storm becomes a moral mystery. If thunder is a natural phenomenon, then it becomes something we can investigate. The same principle can be applied to illness, to human behavior, to the movement of celestial bodies, to the processes of life. The unknown does not automatically require a supernatural explanation. Sometimes it simply requires better knowledge. This intellectual attitude is one of the great achievements of ancient Greek natural philosophy. It helped create a world in which asking, "How does this happen?" could become more important than asking, "Who caused this?" The difference seems small. It is not. One question searches for mechanisms. The other often searches for intentions. And nature does not necessarily possess intentions that resemble our own. Leucippus' universe was therefore profoundly non-anthropocentric. The cosmos did not need human beings in order to exist. The stars did not have to be placed there for us. The earth did not have to be the center of everything. Nature was vast beyond human concerns. This can initially feel humiliating, but it can also be liberating. If the universe is not centered on you, then not everything that happens is about you. A failure does not necessarily mean the universe has rejected you. A success does not necessarily mean the universe has selected you. Another person's achievement does not diminish your existence. A difficult event is not automatically a cosmic judgment. The universe is simply much larger than our personal stories. Recognizing this can produce humility without producing despair. We are small, but being small does not prevent us from being conscious. It does not prevent us from understanding. It does not prevent us from caring. It does not prevent us from creating meaning within our limited existence. This is where the question of mortality returns. If human beings are temporary physical organizations, then death is not an interruption imposed from outside nature. It is part of nature. The arrangement eventually dissolves. The matter continues in other forms. The individual does not. That idea can be frightening because we naturally experience ourselves as continuous. We remember yesterday. We imagine tomorrow. We construct a story called My Life and experience ourselves as the central character within it. The thought that the story can simply end is difficult to accept, but the atomist response is not to pretend death does not exist. It is to understand what death is. If the individual depends upon a particular organization of physical components, then when that organization ends, the individual as a conscious subject ends with it. There is no need to imagine an eternal version of the same person trapped forever inside the condition of death. Death is the end of the living arrangement. This idea would later become one of the most powerful arguments against the fear of death in Epicurean philosophy. But the philosophical lesson begins earlier. Do not fear what you do not understand. Investigate it. The same attitude that asks what matter is made of can ask what death actually means. And once death is placed inside nature, life itself can be viewed differently. The fact that life ends does not make life meaningless. It makes time precious. A human being does not have to live forever to live well. A conversation does not have to last forever to be meaningful. A friendship does not have to be eternal to be genuine. A beautiful day does not become worthless because evening eventually arrives. Temporary things can possess enormous value. In fact, their temporary nature can sharpen our appreciation of them. This is where a philosophy that began with invisible particles eventually becomes deeply human. Leucippus wanted to understand what lies beneath the visible world. But once we adopt that habit of looking beneath appearances, we can apply it to our own lives. Look beneath ambition. What are you really seeking? Look beneath envy. What wound does it reveal? Look beneath fear. What belief is producing it? Look beneath greed. What does the mind imagine will finally be enough? Look beneath the pursuit of status. What happens if nobody is watching? These questions can be uncomfortable because the answers may reveal that some of our strongest desires were never truly our own. We inherited them. We absorbed them from society. We learned them through comparison. We developed them through fear. And yet, once a desire becomes visible to the mind, it can be examined. That is the beginning of freedom. The Atomism tradition, therefore, contains a surprisingly powerful message. Understand causes. Understand nature. Understand yourself. Do not confuse appearance with reality. Do not assume that what everyone desires must be desirable. Do not assume that what you fear must actually be dangerous. Do not assume that what you possess will remain yours forever. And do not assume that because life is temporary, it has no value. These principles do not provide an escape from human suffering. They provide a way of seeing it more clearly, and clarity was at the heart of the ancient philosophical project. Leucippus himself remains partly hidden from us. That is one of the strange facts about his legacy. We know far more about the philosophical system associated with him than we know about the man who first formulated it. His biography is uncertain. His writings have largely disappeared. Many ideas associated with him reach us through later thinkers. Even the exact relationship between Leucippus and Democritus is debated in the surviving evidence. But perhaps there is something fitting about this. The man who taught philosophy to look beneath appearances has himself become something we must reconstruct from fragments. We do not possess the whole person. We possess traces. A few philosophical statements, reports from later writers, a tradition that remembers him as the originator of atomism. And from these fragments, an extraordinary intellectual world emerges. A world in which matter is not endlessly divisible. A world in which empty space exists. A world in which movement is fundamental. A world in which visible objects are temporary arrangements. A world in which nature can be studied without constantly appealing to supernatural intention. A world in which human beings belong to the same natural order they are trying to understand. That last point may be the most important. The philosopher is not outside nature looking in. The philosopher is part of the thing being studied. We are made from the universe. We experience the universe. We think about the universe. And for a brief period, the universe becomes capable of reflecting upon itself through us. Leucippus could not have expressed that idea in modern scientific language, but his philosophy moves toward it. Matter can organize itself into extraordinarily complex forms. One of those forms can become capable of asking what matter is. That is the strange position of the human being. We are temporary. We are limited. We are easily mistaken. And yet we possess the capacity to investigate reality. That capacity should not be wasted. Perhaps this is why the Atomist insistence on looking beneath appearances remains valuable even now. Modern science has transformed almost every detail of the ancient atomic picture. Atoms themselves turned out not to be truly indivisible. Matter contains deeper structures. The physical universe is governed by principles far more complicated than Leucippus could have imagined. Yet the basic philosophical impulse survives. Reality may be stranger than appearance. Invisible structures can explain visible phenomena. Simple principles can generate extraordinary complexity. And knowledge begins when we become willing to question what seems obvious. Leucippus gave philosophy a way to imagine a universe that did not need to be constructed around human concerns. It could simply exist. It could move. It could change. It could form and dissolve worlds. And human beings could still find a place within it, not as masters of the cosmos, not as the center of everything, but as conscious participants in nature. That perspective can produce humility, and humility can produce curiosity. Once you stop assuming that you already understand the world, you become capable of learning. Once you stop assuming that your desires are automatically wise, you become capable of examining them. Once you stop assuming that death must be a supernatural horror, you can begin thinking about mortality with greater clarity. Once you stop demanding permanence from temporary things, you can appreciate them more deeply while they are present. This may be the quiet legacy of Leucippus. He did not give humanity a finished explanation of existence. He gave us a way of asking, what is really there? What lies beneath what appears? What causes change? What makes movement possible? What is the relationship between the visible and the invisible? What happens when arrangements form and dissolve? And if human beings are part of this immense natural order, how should they understand themselves? The first answers were simple. Atoms, void, motion. But simple answers can open enormous worlds of thought. From those three ideas came a new vision of reality. A universe without a permanent human center. A universe where change could be explained without creation from nothing. A universe where destruction could occur without annihilation of matter. A universe where complexity could arise from simpler components. And eventually, a philosophy in which human beings could confront their own desires, fears, and mortality without needing to leave nature behind. Leucippus remains almost invisible in history. Democritus became the more famous name. Epicurus carried atomism into a new ethical world. Lucretius later transformed it into poetry. Modern science would eventually reinvent the study of matter on foundations far removed from ancient speculation. But the original philosophical gesture remains. Look closer. The world is not necessarily what it first appears to be, and perhaps neither are we. Beneath the confident person there may be fear. Beneath anger there may be wounded pride. Beneath endless ambition there may be insecurity. Beneath the desire for possessions there may be a search for safety. And beneath the apparent permanence of the individual, there is a temporary living structure, here for a little while, changing every moment. To recognize this is not to become hopeless. It is to become awake. We do not need to possess the universe. We need to understand our place within it. We do not need to defeat change. We need to understand that change is what makes experience possible. We do not need to escape mortality. We need to stop allowing the fear of mortality to consume the life that exists before it. And we do not need to demand that every moment become extraordinary. A finite life can be lived quietly, intelligently, and deeply. The atoms will continue moving long after our particular arrangement has dissolved. The universe will continue without asking permission. Stars will rise and disappear. Bodies will form and separate. Worlds will change. And eventually, the person listening to these words will also become part of that change. But for now, there is consciousness. There is curiosity. There is the strange privilege of being able to ask what reality is. And perhaps that is enough. Leucippus began by looking at the mystery of change. He answered it by imagining a universe built from indivisible bodies moving through empty space. But the greater lesson hidden inside that answer is about impermanence itself. Everything we encounter is part of a process. Nothing needs to last forever in order to matter. Nothing needs to belong to us permanently in order to be loved. And nothing needs to be explained by fear when reason can begin the search for understanding. The ancient philosopher disappears from history almost as quietly as the particles he imagined. But the question he opened remains. When we look at the world, are we seeing reality itself, or only the surface of something far deeper? And perhaps the most beautiful response is not to pretend that we already know. It is to keep looking,